Ever imagined losing everything except a single cow? In drought-ravaged Texas, Claire Thompson faces the bankruptcy of her farm with only Bessie by her side, until a stranger in an expensive suit breaks down on her property. What happens when opposite worlds collide? A disguised billionaire and a stubborn farmer discover that sometimes the deepest connections emerge in the most unlikely places. Subscribe now and comment. Where are you watching this redemption story that will touch your heart? The merciless July sun beat down on Claire Thompson's weathered farmhouse, its paint peeling in long strips like skin after a severe sunburn. At 35, Claire's face had already collected more lines than seemed fair, each one etching the story of another difficult season into her sun-browned skin. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a practical ponytail as she surveyed the barren pasture that had once been lush grazing land. Third year running, she muttered to herself, squinting at the horizon where heat waves distorted the flat Texas landscape. Daddy always said 3 years of drought would break even the strongest back. The small dairy farm outside Fredericksburg, Texas had been her and Mark's dream, a place of their own away from city life, where they could build something lasting. Now, for years after the accident that took Mark's life, that dream had withered like everything else under the Texas sun. Claire trudged back to the house, her boots kicking up dust that hadn't seen proper rain in 18 months. Inside, she sat at the kitchen table, solid oak that had belonged to Mark's grandmother, and spread out the stack of bills, each marked with alarming red stamps, final notice, and payment past due. The bank letter on top was the most worrying. Claire read it again, though she'd memorized every word. Dear Mrs. Thompson, despite our previous arrangements, your loan remains in serious delinquency. If payment of $4,850 is not received within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings will commence. She pushed the papers away and pressed the heels of her calloused hands against her eyes. The phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the heavy silence. Hello. Claire's voice came out rougher than she intended. Mrs. Thompson? This is Richard Benson from First Texas Agricultural Bank. I'm calling about your outstanding balance. Mr. Benson, I told your colleague last week, I'll have at least half the payment after I sell this month's milk supply. Claire tried to keep her voice steady. I understand your situation, ma'am, but we've extended your terms 3 times already. The drought's affecting everyone, not just you. I'm aware of that, Claire replied, her jaw tightening. What I'm asking for is a little more time. Time doesn't make rain fall, Mrs. Thompson. The bluntness of his words stung, but Claire couldn't argue with their truth. I'll figure something out, she said finally. After hanging up, Claire walked to the window. The water level in the stock pond had dropped another inch overnight. The windmill that once supplemented her well water stood motionless in the still air, its metal blades reflecting the harsh sunlight. She thought about the 5 dairy cows she'd already sold, leaving only Bessie, her best producer. The sale had barely covered last month's feed costs. In the cool darkness of the barn, the only truly comfortable place on the whole property, Claire ran her hand along Bessie's black and white spotted flank. The Holstein's large brown eyes followed her movements with what Claire always thought looked like genuine understanding. Just you and me now, old girl, Claire said softly, setting down the milk pail beneath the cow's udder. The rhythmic sound of milk hitting the metal bucket was as soothing as rainfall. Bessie was more than livestock. She was the last connection to the life Claire and Mark had planned. They'd bought her as a calf during their first year on the farm, and Mark had insisted on naming her after his beloved grandmother. She's sturdy, reliable, and surprisingly affectionate, just like my grandma Bessie was, he'd said with that crooked smile that still appeared in Claire's dreams. Claire leaned her forehead against Bessie's warm side as she milked, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and animal. You're keeping us afloat, you know that? Not many 7-year-old cows still producing like you do. The barn door creaked open, letting in a shaft of blinding sunlight and the silhouette of Hank Wilson, Claire's 70-year-old neighbor from 3 miles down the road. Brought you those spare parts for the irrigation pump, he called out, his voice gruff but kind. Though ain't much point fixing it without water to pump. Claire straightened up. I appreciate it all the same, Hank. Coffee's fresh in the house if you want some. Hank shuffled closer, looking at Bessie with an appraising eye. Sullivan over at the auction house asked if you'd reconsidered his offer. Said he'd still give you $1,200 for her, breeding potential and all. Claire's hands stilled on Bessie's udder. She's worth twice that, and he knows it. Course she is, Hank nodded. But cash in hand is what it is. My Martha always said pride makes for a cold bedfellow. It's not pride, Claire said firmly. Bessie gives enough milk to keep me going and to sell to the Hendersons for their cheese-making business. She's the last investment I have. Hank sighed, picking up one of the empty feed bags. Feed stores raising prices again next month. 20%, I heard. Claire bit her lip and resumed milking. I'll manage. After Hank left, Claire finished the milking and carried the heavy pail to the small processing room Mark had built. It was a point of pride that her operation, though small, met all the state regulations. The stainless steel equipment gleamed from regular cleaning, even if everything else on the farm was showing signs of neglect. Later, as the sun was setting, painting the drought-stricken landscape in deceptively beautiful orange and pink hues, Claire sat on the porch steps. She nursed a glass of iced tea, the last ice from her struggling freezer clinking against the sides. She pulled out Mark's worn leather wallet from her pocket. From it, she extracted a folded photograph. Her and Mark on the day they bought the farm, standing proudly in front of the Thompson family dairy sign he'd hand-carved. In the background, a young Bessie could be seen grazing in what was then a green pasture. I'm trying, Mark, she whispered to the photograph. God knows I'm trying. Tomorrow, she'd take some of Bessie's milk to the Hendersons and collect the payment for last week's delivery. It wouldn't be enough for the bank, but it would buy feed for Bessie, which meant survival for at least another week. As night fell across the parched Texas landscape, Claire gave Bessie a final check before heading to the farmhouse. The cow nuzzled her hand gently. We're going to make it, Claire promised, though whether she was reassuring Bessie or herself, she couldn't say. The temperature had already climbed past 95 degrees by 9 in the morning when Claire spotted a plume of dust rising from her access road. She squinted through the kitchen window, setting down the coffee mug she'd been nursing. Visitors were rare out here, especially on a Tuesday morning in the middle of July when any sensible person stayed indoors. Claire stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare. A sleek black Audi had pulled to a stop where her property's dirt road met the county highway. Even from a distance, she could tell it wasn't the kind of car that belonged out here. The hood was up, and a figure in what appeared to be a suit was bent over the engine compartment. City folks, she muttered, shaking her head. Curiosity got the better of her caution. Claire grabbed her straw hat from its hook and walked down her driveway, the cracked earth crunching beneath her boots. As she approached, she saw steam rising from the vehicle's engine. The man didn't notice her at first. He was tall, with broad shoulders straining against an expensive-looking blue dress shirt. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing tanned forearms now streaked with engine grease. His suit jacket lay carefully folded on the passenger seat, visible through the open door. Overheated, Claire called out when she was about 20 yards away. The man spun around, startled. His face was handsome in a clean-cut way, strong jawline, straight nose, and eyes the color of dark honey. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his carefully styled brown hair was beginning to wilt in the Texas heat. I'm sorry, he said, his voice deep and modulated in a way that suggested boardrooms rather than barnyards. Is this your property? I didn't mean to trespass. My navigation system suggested this was a shortcut to Highway 16, and then he gestured helplessly at the steaming engine. Claire crossed her arms. You're about 8 miles from Highway 16, and that's no shortcut. Your fancy GPS led you astray. The man wiped his brow with his forearm, inadvertently smearing grease across his forehead. Despite her wariness, Claire felt a smile tugging at her lips. I'd offer to help, but I think your car needs to cool down before anyone touches it, she said. And you look like you could use some water before you keel over. That obvious, huh? He extended his hand. Jackson Wells. And yes, water would be incredible right now. Claire hesitated before taking his hand. Claire Thompson. His handshake was firm but not overpowering. Up close, she noticed faint lines around his eyes that suggested he was around her age, though his expensive clothes and well-maintained appearance made him seem younger at first glance. Follow me to the house, she said, already turning. You can wash up and get some water while your car cools down. Jackson fell into step beside her. I really appreciate this, Mrs. Thompson. I've got meetings in San Antonio this afternoon that I'm definitely going to miss now. Ms. Claire corrected automatically. And you're a long way from San Antonio taking this route. As they walked toward the farmhouse, Claire sensed him taking in the property. The peeling paint, the patched roof, the fields where only the hardiest weeds still clung to life. You run this place by yourself? He asked, seeming genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Just me and Bessie now, Claire replied, then clarified. My cow. Once at the house, Claire directed him to the bathroom to clean up while she poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher in her refrigerator. When Jackson emerged, his face and hands were clean, but the grease stain on his expensive shirt remained. Your water is remarkably cold, he commented gratefully, accepting the glass she offered. My well goes deep, Claire said with a hint of pride. One blessing in this drought. Here, let me see your phone. Jackson handed it over without question. Claire checked the screen, confirmed what she suspected, and handed it back. No service. That's why your GPS went haywire. Happens all the time out here. Nearest cell tower is about 15 miles east, and it's spotty at best. Jackson's face fell as he stared at his useless phone. So I'm effectively stranded. Claire studied him for a moment. This polished stranger so obviously out of his element. Against her better judgment, she made a decision. Finish your water, she said. Then we'll see what we can do about your car. From the moment Claire stepped into the blistering heat beside Jackson to examine his stranded vehicle, she knew the Audi wasn't going anywhere soon. The radiator hose had split, spewing coolant across the immaculate engine compartment. Even if they could patch it, the car had lost too much fluid to safely drive the distance to town. That's a serious problem, Claire said, wiping her hands on her jeans after inspecting the damage. Radiator's bone dry. Jackson ran his fingers through his hair, leaving it standing in uncharacteristic spikes. I don't suppose there's a luxury German car dealership hiding behind that hill. His attempt at humor pulled a reluctant smile from Claire. Afraid the closest mechanic is in Johnson City, about 20 miles from here. And Hank's Automotive isn't exactly certified for. She gestured at the Audi's complex engine, whatever all this is. The midday sun beat down on them mercilessly as they stood beside the disabled car. Claire noticed Jackson's face growing increasingly flushed despite his efforts to appear composed. Listen, she said suddenly, surprising herself. You can use my landline to call someone, but it'll be hours before any tow truck gets out here. Why don't you come back to the house and get out of this heat? Relief washed over Jackson's face. That's incredibly kind of you. I promise I won't be a bother. They walked back in silence, the distance seeming longer under the punishing sun. Once inside, Claire poured more water and handed Jackson the ancient cordless phone. Reception's spotty even on the landline, she warned. After several frustrated attempts to reach roadside assistance and his office, Jackson set the phone down with a sigh. No luck. The calls keep dropping. Claire glanced at the old wooden clock on the wall, a wedding gift from Mark's parents. It was already past noon. When's the last time you ate? She asked. Breakfast in Austin, around 6 this morning, Jackson admitted. Claire nodded and moved to the refrigerator, pulling out some eggs and the remains of yesterday's cornbread. I can fix something simple. Please, don't go to any trouble on my account, Jackson protested. It's no trouble, Claire replied, already cracking eggs into a bowl. I need to eat too. As she prepared a modest meal of scrambled eggs and warmed cornbread, Jackson sat at her kitchen table, looking oddly formal despite his rumpled appearance. I've been thinking, Claire said as she set the plates down. I need to take some dairy to the Hendersons' farm this afternoon. It's about 5 miles toward town. I could give you a ride that far, and from there, the cell reception should be good enough to call for help. Jackson looked up, genuine gratitude in his eyes. That would be fantastic. But how would you transport your dairy products? I'm assuming you don't have a refrigerated truck hidden somewhere. Claire allowed herself a small laugh. No refrigerated truck. I usually use the old pickup, but the fuel pump's acting up. For smaller deliveries, I use Bessie, your cow. Jackson looked confused. She pulls a small cart. It's old-fashioned, but it works. She hesitated, then added, the cart has space. You could ride along if you don't mind sharing with some milk jugs. After they finished eating, Claire showed Jackson to the barn where Bessie was contentedly chewing hay in her stall. The cow regarded the stranger with mild curiosity, her large brown eyes blinking slowly. She's beautiful, Jackson said with unexpected sincerity, carefully extending his hand for Bessie to smell. She's the last of my herd, Claire replied, her voice holding a note of pride mixed with sadness. The others had to be sold. Jackson seemed to understand what wasn't being said, and he merely nodded as Claire began hitching Bessie to the small wooden cart. Soon they were underway, the cart rolling slowly down the dusty road with Claire walking alongside Bessie, guiding her with occasional gentle words. Jackson sat in the back of the cart among several carefully packed milk containers, his suit pants collecting dust, his expensive leather shoes looking increasingly out of place. I feel like I've stepped back in time, he remarked, without a trace of mockery in his voice. It's actually quite peaceful. Claire glanced back at him, surprised. Most people would be complaining by now. I'm not most people, Jackson replied simply. And I think I've done enough complaining for one day. After a pause, he added, besides, you've shown me extraordinary kindness when you had every reason to leave me stranded. The simple honesty in his words caught Claire off guard. For the first time, she really looked at Jackson, not as an inconvenience or a fish out of water, but as a person who, despite his obvious wealth and different lifestyle, was capable of genuine gratitude. Well, she said finally, turning back to Bessie, I guess I wouldn't want to be left stranded in this heat either. As they continued their slow journey, the vast Texas landscape stretched out around them, harsh yet beautiful in its austerity, while the unlikely pair made their way toward town, brought together by circumstance but connected, for the moment, by a simple act of generosity. The gentle creaking of the cart wheels and Bessie's steady hoofbeats created a rhythm that seemed to suspend time as they traveled. After a mile of comfortable silence, Jackson shifted slightly on his makeshift seat among the milk containers. So how long have you been running the dairy? He asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. Claire kept her eyes on the dusty path ahead. Mark, my husband, and I bought the place about 9 years ago. He grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin and always wanted his own. She paused, then added quietly, after he passed, I kept it going. I'm sorry for your loss, Jackson said, his tone free of the awkward pity Claire had grown to dread from others. Thank you, she replied simply. Then, to shift the conversation, what about you? What brings a man in an Audi and $1,000 suit to the backroads of Gillespie County? Jackson laughed softly. Is it that obvious I don't belong here? About as subtle as a bull in a china shop, Claire confirmed, a hint of amusement in her voice. Fair enough. He sighed, looking out at the parched landscape. I'm supposed to be meeting with some investors in San Antonio about a new tech development project. My assistant booked the meetings, and I decided to drive from Austin instead of flying. Thought I'd take the scenic route. He shook his head ruefully. Not my best decision. Tech development, Claire echoed. So you're what, a programmer? Jackson hesitated. I oversee various technology investments. It's mostly meetings and spreadsheets these days, not much hands-on work. Something in his careful wording struck Claire as evasive, but she didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for keeping parts of themselves private. As they crested a small hill, the cart will hit a deep rut. Claire instinctively reached out to steady the milk containers while Jackson scrambled to maintain his balance. Sorry about that, she said, gently guiding Bessie around another pothole. County hasn't graded these roads in years. No need to apologize. I'm the city slicker who got himself stranded, Jackson replied with a self-deprecating smile. Though I admit, I didn't expect my Tuesday to involve riding in a cow cart wearing Italian leather shoes. Claire glanced down at his dust-covered footwear and couldn't suppress a laugh. They're definitely getting the authentic Texas ranch experience. Jackson joined in her laughter, and something in the air between them shifted subtly. You know, he said thoughtfully, there's something refreshing about this. In my world, everything is scheduled, digitized, optimized. There's always a faster way, a more efficient solution. He gestured to the open landscape. Out here, things move at their own pace. It's grounding. It's hard work is what it is, Claire countered, though without bitterness. Drought doesn't care about your schedule or your profit margins. I can imagine, Jackson nodded. How bad has it been? Claire squinted at the horizon. 3rd year running. Some folks are calling it the worst since the Dust Bowl days. The big operations can afford deeper wells, irrigation systems, government subsidies. Small farms like mine. She trailed off, unwilling to voice the precarious reality of her situation to a stranger. "You're still here, though," Jackson observed. "That says something." "Stubbornness, mostly," Claire admitted. "Or foolishness, depending on who you ask." They fell into another companionable silence as Bessie plodded steadily forward. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its plaintive cry echoing across the empty fields. "What would you do?" Jackson asked suddenly. "If you could do anything, without worrying about money or drought or any of it, what would you do with this place?" The question caught Claire off guard. It had been so long since she'd thought beyond mere survival that the idea of possibilities felt almost painful. "I'd expand," she said finally, the words coming slowly as she allowed herself to remember old dreams. "Organic operation, grass-fed. A small creamery for artisanal cheese and butter. Mark and I had plans drawn up before." She stopped, then continued more firmly. "The land would support it, with proper water management. The market's there too. People in Austin and San Antonio will pay premium for quality local dairy." Jackson listened intently, without interrupting or offering empty platitudes about how she should follow her dreams. "Sounds like you've given it a lot of thought," he said instead. "Had a lot of time to think," Claire replied, feeling strangely vulnerable having shared so much. "Your turn. If you weren't chasing investors in a fancy car, what would you be doing?" The question seemed to startle Jackson. He looked up at the vast Texas sky, considering. "Honestly, something simpler. Maybe teaching. I studied engineering before I got pulled into the business side of things." A rueful smile crossed his face. "I used to build things with my hands. Now I just build portfolios." There was something in his tone, a weariness beyond physical exhaustion, that resonated with Claire. Despite their obvious differences, she recognized in Jackson a certain kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. The Henderson farm came into view in the distance, its windmill turning slowly against the sky. "We're almost there," Claire said, pointing. "You should be able to get cell service once we reach the crest of that next hill." Jackson nodded, but made no move to ready himself for departure. Instead, he watched Claire's profile as she guided Bessie forward, the sun highlighting the determined set of her jaw and the surprising softness of her expression when she spoke to her cow. Two people from entirely different worlds, brought together by chance on a dusty Texas road, both suddenly reluctant for the journey to end. "You really don't have to stay," Claire insisted as Jackson helped her unload the milk containers at the Hendersons' farm. The elderly couple had been delighted by the unexpected visitor and even more surprised when he'd turned down their offer to drive him into town. "Mrs. Henderson already told me their son is coming with his truck tomorrow," Jackson replied, carefully setting down the last container. "One more day won't make a difference to my meetings. I've already rescheduled everything by phone." Claire straightened, brushing dust from her jeans. "And you want to spend that day at my rundown dairy farm?" "If you'll have me," Jackson said simply. "I could help out to earn my keep." Claire almost laughed at the image of this corporate executive attempting farm work, but something in his expression stopped her. There was a quiet determination there, an earnestness that seemed at odds with his polished exterior. "Fine," she conceded, "but don't say I didn't warn you. Farm work isn't exactly a spa retreat." The journey back to Claire's farm was quieter, both of them lost in thought as the afternoon heat began to wane. When they arrived, Claire immediately set about evening chores, half expecting Jackson to retreat to the porch with his now working phone. Instead, he appeared at the barn door, having discarded his dress shirt for a plain white undershirt. "What can I do to help?" Claire hesitated only briefly before handing him a pitchfork. "Bessie needs fresh bedding." To her surprise, Jackson took to the task with unexpected competence, asking questions when needed, but otherwise working steadily alongside her. His movements were awkward at first, but became more fluid as he adjusted to the physical labor. "You've done this before," Claire observed as they finished the evening milking, Jackson having graduated from observer to assistant with minimal instruction. Jackson smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "My grandfather had a small farm in Pennsylvania. I spent summers there as a kid. It's been years, but some things stick with you." Later, over a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Jackson listened intently as Claire explained the complex economics of small-scale dairy farming, the pricing pressures, regulatory challenges, and rising costs that had pushed so many family operations to the brink even before the drought. It's not that different from what I deal with, he remarked. Just on a different scale? Resource allocation, market pressures, investment versus return. Except your spreadsheets don't get sick or need feeding at 5 in the morning, Claire countered with a smile. True, Jackson acknowledged. And I doubt my board members would appreciate being milked. The unexpected joke startled a laugh from Claire, a real laugh, something she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to remember. Dawn found them both in the barn, Jackson having insisted on joining the early morning routine. Claire watched with growing respect as he tackled each task without complaint, despite the blisters forming on his formerly smooth hands. Why are you really doing this? She asked bluntly as they leaned against the fence, watching the sunrise paint the drought-stricken landscape in deceptively beautiful hues of pink and gold. Jackson was quiet for so long that Claire thought he might not answer. When's the last time you took a day off? He finally asked instead. Claire blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. Before Mark died, I suppose. For years without a break, Jackson said softly. Meanwhile, I have more vacation time than I know what to do with, and I still never use it. He turned to face her, his expression oddly vulnerable in the early light. I think I needed to remember what real work feels like. Not presentations and mergers, but something tangible, something honest. The following days fell into a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Jackson extended his stay, citing delays with parts for his car that they both tacitly recognized as an excuse. Each morning, they worked side by side in comfortable silence. Each evening, their conversations stretched longer as mutual wariness gave way to genuine interest. On the third day, Jackson surprised Claire by fixing the irrigation pump that had been sitting broken in the equipment shed, a simple repair that her limited budget had forced to the bottom of her priority list. When she tried to thank him, he shrugged it off with unexpected humility. Engineering degree has to be good for something, he said, though Claire caught the satisfaction in his eyes when the system hummed to life. By the fifth day, something unspoken had developed between them, a partnership of sorts, built on shared work and quiet moments. Claire found herself watching Jackson when he wasn't looking, noticing how the sun had already darkened his skin, how his movements had adopted the unhurried efficiency of farm life, how his laughter came more easily with each passing day. That evening, as they sat on the porch steps watching darkness settle over the land, the physical distance between them had shrunk to mere inches. Neither acknowledged it explicitly, but both were acutely aware of the other's presence. I should probably tell you something, Jackson said, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice held a tension that immediately put Claire on alert. Before he could continue, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Headlights cut through the gathering dusk as a sleek black SUV made its way up the long drive. Jackson stood abruptly, his expression shifting to something Claire couldn't quite read, resignation mixed with regret. That's my assistant, he said quietly. I asked her to come tomorrow. Oh, Claire said, standing as well, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance. Your car's fixed then? No, Jackson admitted, not meeting her eyes. But there are some things I need to take care of. As the vehicle drew closer, Claire had the distinct impression that the bubble of simplicity they'd been living in was about to burst. Whatever Jackson had been about to tell her hung in the air between them, unspoken but somehow foreboding. The SUV came to a stop in a swirl of dust, its polished exterior gleaming incongruously against the weathered farm buildings. Claire watched as a slim woman in a crisp pantsuit emerged from the driver's side, tablet in hand, scanning the property with barely concealed disbelief before her eyes settled on Jackson. Mr. Wells, she called, her voice carrying a note of relief. We've been so concerned. The board has been calling nonstop, and the Nakamura Group is threatening to pull out of the deal if, Andrea. Jackson cut her off with a raised hand, his posture straightening subtly, authority settling around his shoulders like an invisible suit jacket. I'll handle it. Give me a minute. The assistant's eyes flicked to Claire, taking in her worn jeans and faded work shirt with a quick, assessing glance before nodding crisply. Of course. I'll wait in the car. She retreated, but not before Claire caught her tapping rapidly on her tablet. Mr. Wells. Claire echoed quietly once they were alone again. The board. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. Claire, I should have told you sooner. I'm not just in tech investments. I'm the CEO of Meridian Technologies." The name hung in the air between them. Even in her isolated world, Claire recognized it. One of the largest tech companies in the country, constantly in the news for innovations and acquisitions. "You're Jackson Wells," she said slowly, pieces falling into place. "The Jackson Wells. The billionaire." He winced at the word. "I never meant to mislead you." "Really?" Claire stepped back, creating distance between them. "Because you've had plenty of opportunities to mention it. By the way, Claire, I'm not just some random businessman. I'm one of the richest men in America." It never came up in conversation. Would it have made a difference? Jackson challenged, a flash of frustration crossing his features. "Would you have treated me the same way if you'd known?" "That's not the point," Claire retorted, her voice rising. "The point is you lied by omission." "I didn't come here planning to stay," Jackson said, his tone softening. "But then, these past few days happened. Working with you, talking with you. It felt real in a way my life hasn't for a very long time." Claire crossed her arms, her mind racing to recontextualize every interaction they'd had. "Why is she really here?" she asked, nodding toward the SUV. Jackson hesitated. "There's a situation I need to handle personally. A competitor is attempting a hostile takeover of one of our subsidiary companies. I've been monitoring it remotely, but things have escalated." "So you're leaving?" Claire stated flatly. "Just for a few days," Jackson said quickly. "I'll be back as soon as—" "Don't," Claire interrupted, shaking her head. "We both know this, whatever this is, was never going to last. You have your world, and I have mine." Jackson stepped closer, reaching for her hand, which she reluctantly allowed him to take. "Claire, these past days have meant more to me than you know. Please believe that much at least." The genuine emotion in his voice made something twist painfully in Claire's chest. Despite her anger, she couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, a connection that now seemed impossible to maintain across the chasm of their different realities. "I understand you have responsibilities," she said finally, withdrawing her hand. "So do I." Andrea honked the horn discreetly, shattering the moment. Jackson glanced over his shoulder, conflict evident in his expression. "Go," Claire said, managing a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your board is waiting." Jackson nodded reluctantly. "I will come back, Claire. I promise." She watched him walk to the SUV, noticing how his gait had already begun to shift from the relaxed stride of recent days back to the purposeful walk of her executive. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and a silence that felt emptier than before he had arrived. Claire stood on the porch long after the taillights had disappeared, trying to reconcile the man who had mucked out stalls alongside her with the corporate titan whose face probably graced the cover of business magazines. It seemed impossible they could be the same person. That night, unable to sleep, Claire searched Jackson's name on her old laptop's painfully slow internet connection. Page after page of results confirmed what he'd said. Jackson Wells, tech prodigy turned business mogul, CEO of Meridian Technologies with a personal fortune estimated in the billions. Photos showed him in boardrooms and at charity galas, always impeccably dressed, always wearing the polite, slightly distant smile of someone accustomed to being in the public eye. Nothing in those polished images captured the man who had laughed with genuine delight when Bessie had nuzzled his pocket searching for treats, or who had sat beside Claire in contemplative silence as they watched the sunset paint the drought-stricken land in impossible beauty. As dawn broke, Claire closed the laptop and prepared for another day of work, alone again, just as she had been before a dusty, broken-down Audi had brought Jackson Wells into her life. She tried to convince herself it was better this way, that their worlds were too different for any lasting connection. Yet as she went about her morning chores, every corner of the farm seemed to hold his absence like a physical thing. 3 days after Jackson's abrupt departure, Claire sat at her kitchen table staring at an official-looking envelope that had arrived in the afternoon mail. The return address showed First Texas Agricultural Bank, and her stomach knotted with familiar dread. The bank's final deadline loomed just days away, and she was still far short of the payment amount. With a deep breath, she tore open the envelope, bracing herself for another demand letter. Instead, she found a statement showing her loan balance at zero, along with a formal letter confirming that her mortgage had been satisfied in full. Claire read it 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. A separate note, printed on the bank's letterhead, explained that an anonymous benefactor had paid off her entire debt, including all penalties and fees. "This isn't possible," she whispered to the empty kitchen. She reached for her phone with trembling hands and dialed the bank. After 20 minutes of being transferred between increasingly higher-level managers, she received confirmation that her loan had indeed been fully paid 2 days earlier. "The funds were wired from a corporate account," the bank manager explained. "All completely legitimate, Ms. Thompson. Congratulations, your farm is now free and clear." Claire hung up and sat motionless, stunned disbelief gradually giving way to a different emotion, anger. She knew exactly who was behind this, and the realization burned through her like wildfire. Almost on cue, the sound of tires on gravel alerted her to a visitor. Through the window, she saw the now familiar black Audi pulling up to her house, freshly repaired and gleaming in the afternoon sun. Claire was on the porch before Jackson could even exit his car, the bank papers clutched in her hand. She watched him approach, noting how he'd reverted to his expensive clothes. Dark jeans paired with a casual button-down that probably cost more than her monthly expenses. The easy familiarity they'd established had been replaced by an awkward tension. "You had no right," she said without preamble, holding up the bank statement. Jackson didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you decided to swoop in and solve my problems with your billions. Make the struggling widow your charity case." Claire's voice cracked with emotion. "Did you have fun playing farmer for a week before deciding to buy my gratitude?" Jackson flinched as if she'd struck him. "That's not what happened." "Then what did happen?" she demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you went back to your fancy office and wrote a check to make yourself feel good." "I did it because I care about you," Jackson said, taking a step closer. "Because in 5 days, you showed me more genuine kindness and integrity than I've experienced in years of business dealings." "So you paid for it," Claire shot back. "Like everything else in your world." Frustration flashed across Jackson's face. "What was I supposed to do? I have the means to help, and you were about to lose everything you've worked for, everything you and Mark built together. Would your pride rather see this place in foreclosure?" The mention of Mark hit Claire like a physical blow. She turned away, blinking back tears, her anger momentarily derailed by the painful truth in Jackson's words. "You don't understand," she said more quietly. "This farm was the one thing I was handling on my own. It wasn't easy, but it was mine, my responsibility, my struggle, my life." She faced him again. "You took that choice away from me." Jackson was silent for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "You're right," he admitted. "I acted without considering how it would make you feel. I'm used to solving problems with money and resources. It's what I do every day. But you're not a problem to be solved, Claire. You're—" He hesitated, searching for words. "You're the most real thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember." The sincerity in his voice made Claire's carefully constructed anger begin to crumble. She sank down onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. "I can't accept this," she said, gesturing to the papers. Jackson sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "The money means nothing to me, Claire. Literally nothing. What I earned from selling my first company would fund this farm for generations." He paused. "But I understand that it means something different to you." They sat in silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. A gentle breeze stirred the air, the first hint of relief from the relentless heat in days. "What if we found a middle ground?" Jackson finally suggested. "A way you could keep the farm without feeling like it was charity?" Claire gave him a skeptical look. "Like what?" "A business partnership," he said carefully. "Investment capital to expand, the way you described wanting to do. Organic operation, artisanal products. You'd maintain operational control and ownership of the land. I'd be a silent partner." "You're serious," Claire realized, studying his face. "Completely." Jackson's expression was earnest. "It would be a legitimate business venture. Your knowledge and experience, my capital. The farm would stand or fall on its own merits." Claire looked out over her property, seeing it suddenly not as it was, drought-stricken and struggling, but as it could be. The possibility he was offering felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'd need time to think about it," she said finally. Jackson nodded, relief evident in his features. "Take all the time you need. The debt's already paid, so there's no pressure from the bank anymore." He hesitated, then added, "But there is one thing I need to know now." "What's that?" Claire asked. "If I hadn't paid the debt, if that wasn't between us, would you have given me a chance? As a man, not a billionaire or an investor, just me?" The vulnerability in his question caught Claire off guard. She looked at him, really looked, and saw beyond the wealth and status to the person who had worked alongside her, who had listened to her dreams without dismissing them, who had somehow breached walls she'd built around her heart after Mark's death. "I think," she said slowly, "that was already happening before I knew who you really were." The smile that broke across Jackson's face was genuine and unguarded, reminiscent of the man who had been temporarily freed from his corporate existence during their shared days. "Then we have somewhere to start," he said softly. The hot Texas evening wrapped around them as they sat on Claire's porch, the unresolved tension of their situation hanging in the air between them. The chirping of crickets filled the silence as Claire struggled to articulate the complex emotions swirling inside her. "A business partnership," she finally said, testing the words. "It sounds so transactional." Jackson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It doesn't have to be. It's just a framework that respects your independence." Claire stood abruptly, needing to move. She paced the worn wooden boards of the porch, her boots making hollow sounds against the planks Mark had replaced the summer before his accident. "You waltz into my life for a few days, and suddenly you're restructuring my entire existence," she said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how that feels? To have someone else decide what's best for you without asking." "I wasn't trying to, but you did," Claire interrupted, turning to face him. "That's the problem with people like you, Jackson. You're so used to controlling everything around you that you don't even realize when you're doing it." Jackson stood as well, his expression hardening slightly. "People like me? You mean people who have the means to help others? People who think money is the solution to everything?" Claire retorted. "Who believe they can just write a check and fix what's broken?" "That's not fair," Jackson replied, a rare flash of anger coloring his words. "I didn't pay your debt to control you or to buy your affection. I did it because I couldn't bear the thought of you losing this place while I sat in my office with more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Claire crossed her arms protectively across her chest. "And it never occurred to you that I might want to say in the matter? That maybe I've been fighting this battle for years and needed to finish it my way? Would your way have saved the farm?" Jackson challenged. When Claire didn't immediately answer, he continued more softly. "I'm sorry for overstepping. Truly. But I'm not sorry for preventing the foreclosure." The honesty in his voice made it impossible for Claire to maintain her anger. She leaned against the porch railing, suddenly tired. "You don't understand what it's like," she said quietly. "Since Mark died, people have been trying to make decisions for me, telling me to sell the farm, move to town, get a proper job, as if the life we built here meant nothing." Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "And now I've done the same thing." Claire nodded, relieved that he finally grasped the core of her objection. "The farm was more than just property to us. It was our dream, our future. Every fence post, every repair, every animal. We chose this life together." Jackson moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Tell me about him," he said gently. "Tell me about Mark." The unexpected request caught Claire off guard. No one had asked her to talk about Mark in years. Most people avoided the subject entirely, as if speaking his name might break her. "He was steady," she began hesitantly. "The kind of man who planned 10 steps ahead, but still noticed every sunrise. He could fix almost anything mechanical, but couldn't cook to save his life." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "He believed in this place when everyone said we were crazy to try." "He sounds like someone I would have respected," Jackson said simply. "He would have liked you," Claire admitted. "Despite all." She gestured vaguely at Jackson's obvious wealth. Mark valued honesty and hard work above everything." They stood in silence for a moment, the ghost of Mark Thompson somehow present in the space between them. "I need to know something," Claire said finally. "Was any of it real? The man who stayed here, who fixed my pump and helped with chores, was that really you, or just a billionaire playing cowboy?" Jackson's expression grew serious. "It was the most authentic version of myself I've been allowed to be in years." He ran a hand through his hair, searching for words. "My life in San Francisco, the board meetings, the constant pressure. Sometimes I feel like I'm just playing a role that was assigned to me when my first company took off. "And here?" Claire asked. "Here I was just Jackson. Not Mr. Wells, not the CEO, not the face on the business magazines." He looked out over the darkening fields. "Do you know how rare that is for someone in my position? To be valued for your actions rather than your assets." Claire studied his face, recognizing the truth in his words. Despite his privileged existence, there was a kind of loneliness in Jackson that mirrored her own, different in origin but similar in depth. "I can't promise anything," she said carefully. "This is all happening too fast." "I'm not asking for promises," Jackson replied. "Just a chance to find a way forward that respects what you've built here and allows me to help without undermining your autonomy." The practical, pragmatic part of Claire, the part that had kept her going through grief and hardship, recognized the wisdom in his offer. The emotional part remained wary, protective of both her independence and her heart. "I need time," she repeated, "and space to think clearly." Jackson nodded, accepting her terms without argument. "I understand." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, paying your debt wasn't just about helping you. In a way, I was protecting something precious to me too. This place, these days we shared, the woman who treated me like a person instead of a walking bank account." His candor disarmed her final defenses. Claire found herself reaching for his hand, the contact sending an unexpected warmth through her. "Stay for dinner," she offered quietly. "We can talk more about this partnership idea of yours." The hope that kindled in Jackson's eyes told her more about his true intentions than any words could have conveyed. Whatever happened next, Claire knew with sudden certainty that his feelings for her were genuine, complicated by wealth and circumstance, but real nonetheless. As they walked back into the house together, the first stars appearing in the darkening Texas sky, Claire allowed herself to consider a future different from the one she had resigned herself to. A future where dreams long abandoned might still have a chance to flourish. The week that followed brought changes to the Thompson farm that Claire would never have imagined possible. After their dinner conversation had stretched late into the night, they'd reached a compromise that preserved her dignity while accepting Jackson's help. Instead of an outright partnership, they had drafted a plan for a small business loan with fair terms. One that would allow Claire to repay the debt that Jackson had settled while providing additional capital for the improvements the farm desperately needed. On this particular evening, the setting sun cast a golden light across the property as Claire and Jackson walked the perimeter, discussing the future with a tentative optimism that felt both strange and exhilarating. "The well driller can start next month," Jackson said, consulting the notes on his phone. "Once we have reliable water access, the new irrigation system can go in before winter." Claire nodded, mentally mapping the changes against her knowledge of the land. "The north pasture will green up first once we get water to it. Best soil on the property." They stopped at the fence line, looking out over the drought-stricken acres that somehow appeared more hopeful now, pregnant with possibility rather than despair. "The organic certification process takes 3 years," Claire continued, her voice animated in a way it hadn't been in ages. "But we can start transitioning practices immediately. The Henderson Dairy already has contacts with specialty markets in Austin." Jackson smiled, watching her face as she spoke. "You've thought this through carefully." "I've had years to plan," Claire admitted. "Just never had the means to implement any of it." A comfortable silence fell between them as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. In the distance, the lights of Jackson's rented cabin, a concession to propriety they had both agreed was necessary, twinkled on the adjacent property. "I have to go back tomorrow," Jackson said finally, his voice holding a note of reluctance. "The board meeting can't be postponed again." Claire nodded, having expected this moment. Despite the pragmatic nature of their arrangement, something deeper had continued to develop between them over the days they'd spent planning the farm's revival. "I know," she said simply. Jackson turned to face her, his expression serious. "I meant what I said before. This isn't charity, Claire. It's an investment in something I believe in, both the farm and—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity, "and the person running it." Claire felt the weight of his words, the careful balance he was trying to maintain between his evident feelings for her and his respect for her independence. "I've been thinking about what you said," she replied carefully, "about finding a middle ground between our worlds." "And?" Jackson prompted when she paused. "And I think maybe there is one." Claire looked up at him, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since Mark died. But we'd have to build it ourselves. No blueprints, no guarantees. Jackson's face softened as he understood what she was offering. Not a promise, but a possibility. I've built things from scratch before, he said, a smile tugging at his lips. Usually with better results than my attempts at fixing that fence over there. Claire laughed, remembering his good-natured frustration with the barbed wire that had seemed determined to thwart his city-bred hands. The sound of her laughter carried across the open land, unfamiliar yet right. "You'll come back?" she asked, the question simpler than the complex emotions behind it. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Jackson replied, then added with a teasing glint. "Or even one particularly stubborn Holstein cow." As if on cue, Bessie's distinctive moo sounded from the barn, causing them both to laugh again, the tension of the moment breaking into something warmer. "I should finish the evening chores," Claire said, though she made no move to leave. "I'll help," Jackson offered, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the barn, close enough that their hands occasionally brushed against each other. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Texas sky an endless blue canvas above them as Jackson loaded his overnight bag into the Audi. Claire stood by the porch steps, Bessie grazing contentedly nearby in a scene that seemed to embody the contradiction of their situation, the sophisticated car and the simple farm, existing in the same frame. "The contractors have all my contact information," Jackson said, closing the trunk. "And I've set up the accounts for the farm improvements. Everything is in your name, with me as guarantor on the loan." Claire nodded, appreciating the care he'd taken to respect her autonomy even while providing substantial resources. "I know how to reach you if I need anything." They stood facing each other, neither quite ready for the moment of departure. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, free and untethered. "This feels different than last time," Jackson observed. "It is different," Claire replied. "Last time you were leaving a fantasy. This time," she gestured around them, "this is real. Complicated and messy and real." Jackson stepped closer, his expression serious yet hopeful. "I don't regret paying your debt, Claire, but I do regret not discussing it with you first. I'm learning." "We both are," she admitted. He reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, the contact sending a familiar warmth through her. Without overthinking, Claire stepped forward and embraced him, feeling his arms encircle her waist with gentle pressure. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not just for the financial help, but for reminding me that there's more to life than surviving." When they separated, Jackson's eyes held a question he didn't voice. Instead, he said simply, "I'll be back in 2 weeks. Sooner if I can manage it." Claire nodded, finding herself genuinely looking forward to his return. "I'll be here, the farm and I both." As Jackson's car disappeared down the long drive, Claire didn't feel the emptiness she had expected. Instead, there was a curious sense of anticipation, of chapters yet to be written. She turned toward the barn where work awaited, Bessie following with placid interest. The drought wasn't over, and the challenges ahead remained substantial. But for the first time in years, Claire Thompson walked her land with the certainty that she wasn't facing those challenges alone. The future stretched before them, unwritten and full of possibility. Whether their connection would blossom into love or settle into friendship remained to be seen. But standing in the Texas sunlight, with plans for renewal taking shape around her, Claire allowed herself to believe that sometimes, even in the most barren landscapes, something beautiful could grow. Drop a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched till the end," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh,